It's not a unique situation. In history or in our day, Christians are failing. Lay people and pastors are failing every day and bringing reproach upon the gospel. Individually at your office, if you are known you're a Christian and then you do something out of character, it brings reproach upon the gospel. Who has not let Jesus down? Historically and now, we are letting Jesus down regularly, and we should be penitent people and be slow to judge. You got a log in your eye. God has historically been willing, I'm thinking of Philippians 1 now, been willing to use people to speak gospel truth who have motives and attitudes that are defective. It says in Philippians 1, they were preaching the gospel to make Paul feel bad in prison. That stinks. And Paul says, what then? That Christ is proclaimed. Whether good motives or bad motives, I rejoice. God is unbelievably merciful to use you and me with our defects to speak gospel truth. You got to have a category for gospel faithfulness in defective containers. We have a beautiful, glorious treasure in a broken clay pot that can be worse than some people think it can be.
When looked at on the surface, leadership within the Christian church can seem perplexing at best. I've had a lot of time to think about this because in the fulfilling of my bachelor's degree, I've been taking a lot of classes on Christian leadership. And this thought has come into my mind several times. Why would God set things up in such a way that fallible people are leading other fallible people? Why are people who are so unworthy to represent God and who are so horrible at representing God sometimes, why are they put in charge of other people who are just as horrible at representing God? Since I'm in the business of theorizing, sometimes I think to myself, why couldn't God have put angels or Jesus himself as the physical leader of the Christian church? Because then at least we would have someone leading the church who is not prone to failure and who is a qualified representative of God. But that's not the reality we live in, is it? The people physically in our churches leading in the flesh are not angels, nor are they Jesus. They're people, fallible, fleshly, sinful people just like you and me. And maybe it's just me who's had this mental dilemma thinking, why in the world would our Christian leaders be who they are, and why wouldn't angels or Jesus be leading us? Maybe that's just me. But this idea of fallible human beings being led by other fallible human beings, cut from the very same cloth, it was bothersome to me. I knew that was the way it had to be because that's the way that God has set things into motion. But I just couldn't help wondering, why did God make it that way? My wondering became even more justified in my mind when I thought of all the times I had heard of Christian leaders falling into sin and being involved in some kind of scandal. How many times have you heard of a pastor having to resign or being fired because he was caught in some kind of sexual misconduct, or he was embezzling funds, or he was caught doing something that was absolutely reprehensible and not representative of the church or Christ at all? I myself have been privy to several of those situations, and they're horrible situations, and it just compounds that feeling of, why would God make it this way? It seems like the Christian church is being set up to fail right off the bat. It just seemed to me to be such a perplexing paradox that those who are called and chosen to be representatives of Christ for thousands of people, that these people could also be ones to fall, and in their falling push so many away from God and make people even despise God. It's no joke when a Christian leader falls, because they're capable of dragging so many down with them. They're capable of hurting so many people and alienating so many more. And that's why the system of leadership seems so troubling to me, because it has the potential to fail catastrophically. The system of Christian leadership, the way God chose to set it up, just seemed risky to me. So all of this had been on my mind just recently. And then a couple weeks ago, I watched a sermon by Matt Chandler, and it's the sermon he delivered at the Passion 2019 conference. Chandler started out this sermon in a very interesting way. He said, I saw a picture of Jesus Christ the other day, an artist rendition of Jesus Christ, and it showed him with a halo, glowing, very angelic, very perfect facial features. And he said that painting was interesting to me because I thought to myself, that doesn't look like a very helpful Jesus. That doesn't look like a very helpful Savior. And he explained himself like this. He said, if Jesus is this ethereal spiritual being who never came down into the muck and the mire of the world, and who never experienced life with human beings and who never interacted one-on-one with people who are hurting and who are desperate. He said we as people could look at him and learn some principles about him, but we would not be able to apply anything we learned from Jesus to our everyday lives, to our hurts, to our pains, to our everyday encumbrances, because we wouldn't have had the opportunity to see Jesus apply those principles to his pain, his encumbrances, his temptation. So instead of Jesus remaining in heaven and keeping himself separate from sinful humanity, he became flesh. He came into the muck and the mire and the pain of a dying world, and he experienced it all with us so that he could be an example of how to live properly in this world. And so this idea intrigued me because I thought to myself, maybe Jesus' strategy of becoming relatable, becoming one with the people he was saving and the people he was trying to help, maybe this is the same strategy that God intended for Christian leaders within the Christian church. Because who better to give advice to a sinful, carnal Christian on how to overcome that sinfulness and overcome that carnality to some extent than a person who is also sinful and carnal and who has experienced the process of rising above those things already. One of the things that makes an effective leader or teacher is experience that says, I've been there, I overcame it, and this is how you can overcome it too. Let me help you. Now, don't be mistaken. Don't think I'm letting off the hook every pastor and Christian leader who has in some way majorly embarrassed the church or had some major moral failure. I'm not letting those people off the hook. A lot of those people probably ought not be Christian leaders. They are people who fell prey to their own sinful desires. There's a reason that there are standards of Christian leadership in the Bible that leaders must live up to. Because the people leading us to God, they ought to know the most about God. They ought to have the closest relationships with God. And they ought to be the best of us. So don't take me as saying we should just reinstate every Christian pastor who has had an affair or who has embezzled money. No, that's not what I'm saying. Those people ought not be Christian leaders, at least not for a very long time after something like that happens. What I am saying, however, is that it seems that God is willing to risk failure of a Christian leader, leading to possible alienation of hundreds or thousands. He's willing to risk that in order to have the most effective kind of leader, the kind of leader who relates with the people he's leading, who is able to lead them through things he has gone through. Yes, church leaders ought to live up to and uphold the standards laid forth in the Bible for Christian leadership. They ought to be blameless before God. They ought to have such a good relationship with God that their whole life just reeks of God's goodness. But a good Christian leader also has to be in a position where he knows what it's like to be tempted, where he knows what it's like to do wrong and have to ask forgiveness for that wrong. But he also needs to be in a position where he has overcome those things and where he can say, let me help you overcome these things too, because I know how to do it. I've been through it. So let me help you.